Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, March 29th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the Democratic Party and them changing their nomination process for the 2024 presidential election year. Now, for the past few decades, the Democratic primary has been relatively similar. You start out in Iowa, then you move to New Hampshire, then you move to Nevada, then you move to South Carolina, and then a bunch of states sort of jumble up into multiple Super Tuesdays and Super Thursdays and multiple events in which the Democratic primary proceeds. Now, looking at the Democratic nomination process for 2024, things are still very much up in the air. I made a video back in June of 2021 talking about how Democratic caucuses are likely to disappear. And I cited the fact that in 2016, you saw caucuses in the double digits. You saw many states implement caucus systems that were, in many people's eyes, viewed as undemocratic. Now, the reason why they were viewed as undemocratic is a little bit disputed. On one hand, people argue that because people will have to be in a place for hours on end and have to listen to canvassers and politicians, that it does make it more difficult for people that are older, people that are more inclined to vote through a traditional primary. And I think the Democratic Party really recognized that when they saw that in 2016, many states that held primaries along with caucuses found that Hillary Clinton won the primaries, but caucuses ended up going to Bernie Sanders. And there seems to have been a relationship between younger voters being more inspired and more enthused to stand in line and to stand at the caucuses for hours on end and have the ability to do so compared to older voters. Now, that is all something that is just really in discussion about whether or not a caucus system should actually be utilized for a primary system. But a lot is changing even beyond that small, simple measure. In 2020, you saw a dramatic reduction in caucuses down into single digits, and for 2024, you might actually see an additional decrease in that. But that's not even the biggest change that this CNN article is actually writing about. It talks about significantly altering the presidential primary, mainly because the Democratic Party is considering taking away the state of Iowa. Now, I know that sounds weird, right? The state of Iowa is always the first in the nation caucus. Everybody watches it. But understand that the state of Iowa, as the Democratic Party has now started to cite, has become a lot less competitive. In 2000, it was decided by 0.31. In 2004, it was decided by 0.67. Obama won it by pretty solid amounts. Won it by 10, then won it by a margin of 6 points. And Democrats were happy about that. They said, we are able to compete here. In years past, Democrats haven't always been winning Iowa, but Republicans have, still kept themselves in a competitive position, as have Democrats. Then came 2016, in which Iowa swung by over 15 points to the right. In 2020, it swung by a little bit less compared to 2012, but ultimately it was still 15 points to the right of where it was back in 2012. And looking at the midterm elections in between, in the Senate elections and the governor election, the House elections, Republicans have made it clear in Iowa that this is very much their state. And the Democrats don't like that. You see, it seems as if they're fine with New Hampshire and Nevada, primarily because these remain as swing states. In 2016, Nevada was decided by 2.4, New Hampshire was decided by 0.37. In 2020, New Hampshire was decided by 7, still outside of that, swing state status fully, but Nevada was still decided by 2.4%. At the end of the day, what the Democratic Party pointed out was that these states are toss-ups and competitive, whereas sometimes Iowa really isn't. It also came down to demographics. You see, during the 2020 Democratic primary season, what we found was that Joe Biden really had some major lackluster results. In the Iowa caucus, Joe Biden placed, third, fourth? We can actually go ahead and check out. Maybe it's going to go ahead and make us pay for the website here. Pete Buttigieg came in first. Bernie Sanders came in second. Elizabeth Warren came in third. And Joe Biden came in fourth. Now, if you remember back during the primary season, for me personally, I knew that Joe Biden was going to win this primary. I had made videos about it years prior, saying that Joe Biden was undoubtedly going to be the Democratic nominee because it was the obvious answer. Joe Biden was the former vice president. He became the frontrunner as soon as Hillary Clinton lost and had maintained that status up until about Iowa and New Hampshire. Now, what happened was that Joe Biden really dropped the ball. But the problem was that not necessarily, Joe Biden was just a lackluster candidate between then and the time that he surged to support, because you're talking about a difference of maybe just 2 or 3 weeks in the time that Pete Buttigieg went from winning Iowa to dropping out of the presidential race, that Joe Biden went from being 4th and 5th in New Hampshire to winning the Democratic primary. What happened was that looking at what the results were for Biden, these states did not accurately capture the minority representation in the Democratic primary. What you found was that states such as Iowa and New Hampshire were 85% or more white. You were finding that these states were not indicative of how Democratic primary voters early on were thinking. Anyone could have told you that as soon as the black electorate entered into the Democratic primary, that Biden's numbers would rise. Opinion polling data told you that Biden's numbers and strengths were not under white voters, but instead under black voters. And that's exactly why when you hit South Carolina, Biden won in a landslide. Keep in mind, Bernie had the momentum. One in Iowa, one in New Hampshire, one in Nevada, and then you hit South Carolina, and all of a sudden, Biden ties Bernie Sanders in terms of delegates, and then by Super Tuesday, completely demolishes him. Wins in Alabama, Arkansas. These are some states with high minority population, specifically a high black population in the Democratic primary. North Carolina, Tennessee. What you also find is high Hispanic populations, Oklahoma, Texas, right? States where you start to see these numbers build back better for Biden. And specifically in the state of Nevada, what you will find is that although Bernie Sanders did win, Joe Biden referenced the state of Nevada as a state that put Joe Biden back on the map. Not because he came close to victory, because he very much did not, lost by 27 points, but what you found was that Biden was able to turn Nevada into a state that showed a little bit of what minority representation within the Democratic primary could do, and it resulted in a Biden victory. So Democrats, after seeing such a monumental shift in support between before Super Tuesday and after within the Democratic primary in 2020, they started to realize that states such as Iowa and New Hampshire are not really representative of the Democratic electorate. When you look at who votes in the Democratic primary, a significant portion are black voters, a significant portion are Latino voters, a significant portion are Asian voters. What you are finding is that the states of Iowa and New Hampshire do not at all replicate the diversity and the inclusivity of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, however, I would say it does. The Republican Party is routinely the only party that the white electorate votes for across this nation. When you take a look at white voters across the nation, they are the only group, racial breakdown-wise, that backs the Republican Party. So Iowa and New Hampshire might make sense there. It is statistically and registration-wise proven that minority voters tend to side with the Democratic Party in a margin of about 80 to 20, routinely. Now, looking at what the reasoning being, they mention these things. They mention how it really just doesn't make sense to go into these states because the country is changing. A committee member here, a Democratic strategist, Maria Cardona, said that the need for the party of diversity to actually implement a process that is trustworthy and open and transparent that also reflects all of the diverse communities that we have, that we say we represent, they expect the system to change because, quote, our country is changing, we need to change with it. Another person says, we cannot be stuck in a 50-year-old calendar when we were trying to win 2022 and 2024 elections. This has to be an ever-evolving process. Now, some people are pushing back, saying that Iowa has chosen the right nominees in the past. They chose Hillary Clinton, right? They've chosen the victors in other elections. But the problem is sometimes they're wrong, and they don't always choose the strongest candidate according to some. And I don't think that it is all an indicator of what you might think. What the Democratic Party also wants to do, I believe from this, is put forth some of the more competitive and larger states in the beginning of the schedule. What that means is states such as California that otherwise would be later down the line. In 2016, it was in June. In 2020, it was in March. What you found was that California, while moving back and forth, ultimately, that state is a huge state. And it does help us understand who is going to win the Democratic and Republican primaries. Democrats are hoping that a state such as California, which is culturally diverse, regionally diverse, whatever it might be, would help represent and help gauge the country and the party's direction when it comes down to a 2024 nominee. They are right. That process that was put in place 50 years ago might not necessarily be a process that they need to stick through with for the rest of their existence. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party have existed since the 1800s. But here's the thing. The primary process is relatively new. You see, in older elections, it was just the elites that chose who ran for Democratic nominee and who ran as the Republican nominee. Then became open conventions, then led to Democratic primaries in certain states. Only until about the past few decades has the Democratic primary and the Republican primary been open to every single state should they choose to hold one. In 2020, many states canceled their Republican primaries because it was clear that Donald Trump was going to be their nominee. At the end of the day, what I see from the 2024 presidential election and what I see from the Democratic Party's willingness and meaning to change their overall primary structure is that they want to represent minority voters better. I see it as them trying to keep minority voters in their column. When you have minority voters that very clearly want to vote one way, but you have to wait through 2 elections to get there, 2 heavily watched elections, it does seem somewhat of a lack of attention on diversity. The Democratic electorate is heavily reliant on minority voters through and through. Without them, the Democrats would not win because Republicans, again, routinely win white voters. So when you have a state such as New Hampshire, or you have a state such as Iowa that does not at all represent the diversity of the Democratic primary, there are voters out here who will feel left out of the process. Many states will as well. I'm sure Iowa and New Hampshire won't necessarily take kind to the fact that they will be moved out of being the first in the nation. I'm sure there's a lot of attention on these states. Keep in mind that New Hampshire and Iowa receive more visits than any other states in the nation. There are plenty of states with larger populations. Think about Florida, for instance. Does it make sense that New Hampshire gets many more visits in the state of Florida? Does it make sense that because California sometimes is in June, that California will receive maybe just a fraction of the visiting that Iowa already has? Even now, candidates are visiting Iowa. I kid you not. Marjorie Taylor Greene was there. Matt Gaetz was there. Ted Cruz was there. Mike Pompeo was there. All of these people were there. Why? Because they know, at least they expect, it to be a first-in-the-nation type of state. Now, Democrats, of course, aren't exactly fielding up for 2024. They know it's either going to be Biden or Harris. So what they find is that they aren't visiting these states. They aren't focusing a lot of their attention on it. But Republicans certainly are. Now, Democrats also might find a lot less pushback on changing the nomination process for 2024 because there's not an expected competitive Democratic primary. If this was 2016 or 2020, they might have seen some pushback. After the Iowa caucuses showed some significant technical mishaps and things that were changing in terms of overall delegate count in the state of Iowa, there was a lot of calls on Iowa to no longer remain the first in the nation. And in many ways, I think those calls were founded in, just more so anger at the process, right? A lot of those calls came as a direct response to the fact that Iowa was just simply messing up their voting process for whatever reason. They didn't get the right software, whatever it might be, right? And those calls, I think, came out of anger. But these discussions that are happening now are coming out of an idea of representation and an idea of how this will impact the Democratic electorate. And I think the Democratic Party right now is going to start and phase out caucus systems. In addition to that, moving out Iowa, moving out other states, and replacing them, or at least pushing other ones further upwards. States that are, more diverse in population and more representative of the Democratic Party. Because I think that will, number one, benefit them when it comes down to elections and it comes down to overall representation. And it also provide them with that needed security and needed coverage, that some of these states previously did not have. California will probably receive a lot more visits should the map change. States such as Florida and North Carolina and Texas and New York, large states in population, will likely receive much more if the focus isn't just on 2 smaller states that could technically, yes, build momentum, but don't necessarily provide us with an actual depiction of what the Democratic Party electorate looked like. I think it was a shock for many people on the side of Bernie Sanders with all of that momentum from Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, halted by a singular state, and halted because black voters chose Biden, because they they supported him, they really liked him, and the numbers showed that. But none of the primary contests or caucus contests showed us that until South Carolina. So I'm sure it hit many members of the Bernie wing like a truck. It said, even with all that momentum, you are not cracking the South. You are not getting into this territory that was already secured for Biden the moment that Hillary Clinton lost the election. And I'm not saying this in a way that tries to insinuate that Biden is at all, necessarily is only deserving of those votes, that he is just, this one person who's the only person who can get it. No, I'm not trying to make that argument. What I'm trying to make the argument is that it was very clear from the beginning who black voters wanted to be the 2020 Democratic nominee, and all of that discussion was curtailed because Iowa and New Hampshire gave us false depictions of what the Democratic Party electorate looked like and what we should expect. Now, personally, I think looking at moving up some more diverse states to the earlier parts of the primary process could also help me as an an election analyst, because it'll give me a better idea of how the Democratic primary is going to go. I don't know what the response will be or what the vote will be when it comes down to this nomination process, but this is truly the biggest shift and biggest move that they've made in the past couple of decades when it comes down to the nomination process, and honestly, I could see them moving forward through with it. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.